Welcome back. 42 degrees out there this morning, 6:25 right now. Some video games have been coming under fire for being too violent. The controversy is even prompting some video game makers to institute their own rating system.
President Trump hosted a meeting with video game makers and their critics at the White House today. He was busy. They're looking for ways to reduce youth violence following the Florida school shooting. And the president recently expressed shock at what young people are exposed to today.
The belief that video games are causing rampant violence among American youth has been sparking discussion for now nearly 3 decades. Stemming all the way back to the 1990s with the release of new and more graphic games like Doom, Grand Theft Auto, to even more recent games as absurd and as innocent as Pokemon Go, parents and adults alike seem to have always tried to pin the violence of American youth on video games without even looking at other possible influencing factors. After the massive increase of shootings in America lately, adults including the President of the United States began more regularly voicing the idea that video games were the sole cause of violent youth. In response to the Parkland shooting this year, President Trump endorsed the idea after saying to Florida State's Attorney General,
I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts,
which seems to back his ideas from a similar tweet he made in 2012. As household consoles became more popular throughout the early 90s, the graphics on screen developed alongside them. Going from simple 8-bit pixel sprites to more complex images in the new 16 and 32-bit styles, game developers were provided with the artistic option to have more complex imagery. Games released in the early 90s following the release of these 32-bit consoles and computers quickly took advantage of the new graphical limitations. One of the more popular games, Doom, developed by popular creators, id Software, was released in 1993 to surprisingly massive success. Doom's new first-person game mechanics and unrivaled success would go on to spawn its own genre of copycat games, nicknamed the Doom Clone, or more recently renamed first-person shooters. This new genre would single-handedly dominate the video game market in years to come. It would also be the major driving force behind the entire argument. Other later successful and massive franchises like Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty, and Halo would only add fuel to the flames. Usually following a shocking event, most people will tend to seek out a simple reason to blame for causing the tragedy. Yet more often than not, and because it's easier to digest, most will blame tragedies on video games that have mature themes. In response, researchers, psychologists, and other doctors have tried to find any sort of a real connection between violent youth and video games. Most findings did say that video games and other violent media may be one factor that leads to violence, yet there are so many other factors, so blaming the violence on primarily video games wouldn't be conclusive. In his research, Whitney DeCamp, an associate professor of sociology at Western Michigan University, says that the evidence points to either no relationship between playing video games and violent behavior, or an insignificant link between the two. DeCamp continues by stating that putting the two concepts in a vacuum simply can't display a definitive answer. He discovered that playing video games, no matter how bloody, did not predict violent behavior. And that's one of the major flaws with the argument. There is no definitive, clear answer. How a person grows up to act all stems from his or her childhood, and most children are raised to know that violence isn't good, and that the media they consume is mostly make-believe. At least that's how it seems most kids are raised. In an article by the Forensic Examiner written in 2004, the author describes how early childhood experiences can dictate future behavior. It does so by giving a brief synopsis of developed behavior, stating that children learn through observation. At a very young age, children mimic behaviors and absorb new ways of accomplishing tasks. Through practice, children optimize their competence and mastery of behaviors. Through reinforcement, these behaviors become a part of these children's style of interacting with others. The article then continues to explain how it's up to the parents to discourage deviant concepts and ideas at an early age, the same thoughts that are displayed to all Americans within our media and our culture. By failing to correctly instruct our children, and mostly through childhood neglect, some children will accept the violent behaviors they see in media as acceptable without even acknowledging it. This is when video games do become a cause of violent acts. Nicholas Cruz, the 19-year-old accused of gunning down 17 people on February 14th at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, reportedly played video games for up to 15 hours a day. People like our president blame this massacre on video games, and in part they're correct. These games exposed Cruz to the violent natures of war and its destructive acts. The challenges and in-game achievements also awarded him for thinking hard about violent behavior, and he felt successful. He then continued to think that violence was acceptable. The sheer realism of war displayed in more modern games like Call of Duty is probably what familiarized him with weapons and tactics made to kill. If you ask any kid who's played a first-person shooter game before, I bet they are equally as familiar. However, most kids are taught that these games are just games, and they look past the violence and simply play the game for a competitive way to pass time. The violence is left in the virtual world, or on the screen. So we know Cruz had a history of neglect and mental issues. Thus, his mental stress and troubles within his personal life was likely the source of his violence. His anger and distress built up his violent personality. By not having anyone to express his issues to, it seemed video games simply provided him with an outlet to express or fuel his twisted emotions, until eventually he decided to carry them over into the real world. This is why most parents and the other percent of doctors and psychologists in the world are against violent video games. To be honest, both the American Psychological Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics take a firm stance against children and teens playing violent video games. Some children just don't have the guidance they need to understand that this violence they see in media is fictional, and that certain behaviors should not be celebrated. It's then that video games won't cause this sort of violence. It's then that hopefully the anger a video game produces will only come from losing in a competitive match. The same sort of anger, which is called saltiness or toxicity in the gaming community, is also condemned by fellow players in team-based games. Sure, losing a close match in a game like Counter-Strike has made someone mad before, but after losing, you're supposed to just walk away. You know it's only a game. Millions of players do. To be exact, over 150 million Americans and 71% of teens play video games. There has been 71 mass shootings between 1982 and August of 2015, 7 of which involved shooters age 18 or younger. So it's safe to assume many young people play violent video games nowadays, and most won't show violent behaviors or ever commit atrocities. In fact, new team-based games like Fortnite reward players for working together, being social, within their 4-player squads mode. So although you may have to fire a couple shots to win a game, the rewarding team aspect may actually help young kids develop positive skills and social behaviors that could in turn help them in the real world. So in short, do video games cause violence? It honestly depends. If kids are properly raised to be smart enough to know right from wrong, and that violence is never truly the answer for any problems, video games won't ever cause violence. It seems that when our children are neglected, mistreated, and mistaught, that video games will cause them to become aggressive or violent. So then the real problem becomes parenting. If you believe your child knows right from wrong, and that they're mature enough to handle and disregard the mature themes and play the game respectfully, there is no problem. These games won't cause them to become violent masters of evil, they'll just get a kick out of destroying their friends or the enemy team in a virtual environment. In the end, for most people who play video games, it's just a form of escapism through an interactive media.